Paul's going to be in Jerusalem. And so there's no real movement involved yet. The next map I threw up will to kind of track his journey to Rome.
We are in Acts 21.
For the next, he's in Jerusalem right now. If you remember, he's come back after his third missionary journey. He's reported to James and the elders of the church there in Jerusalem, and it's resulted in a great worship service. Paul's ministry has been blessed by God, resulting in many people throughout the empire coming to faith in Jesus Christ, and many churches being established throughout the Roman Empire. As he's come back and reported, we've also seen not only has God been moving around the Roman Empire, but God's been moving in the nation of Israel. And they report that their ministry, God has blessed their ministry to the Jews there in Israel. And many people have come to understand that Jesus is the Messiah and accept that and be added to the church there in Jerusalem. And so there's this great worship service that goes about that we saw last week, that God is on the move. It's not about Paul. It's not worshiping Paul. It's not even really praising Paul. It's praising God working through Paul. And it's not about the apostles. It's about God and his movement to fulfill his plan, to bring his people, those that he's called predestined, into his kingdom and his kingdom come. But while he's there, there is a division that arises, and that's from the Jews there that say, look, we've had all these people come to faith, and they keep the law. And we're being told, notice there's no assertion of facts, we're being told that you teach Jews living amongst the Gentiles that they don't have to follow the law, they don't have to circumcise their kids. They don't have to keep the Jewish holidays that God's established for us to remember and worship him. And so it causes an issue. There's a potential division in the church that has to be dealt with. And so James and the elders say, Paul, here's what we want you to do. We want you to go and take a vow. And we have 4 men that are under a vow. We want you to take them and pay for their vow. Pay for the sacrifices necessary for the vow. Give notice of this vow in the temple per the law. And as people see you obeying in the law, they'll know that there's nothing to this rumor that you do not accept the law for Jews. Now, again, remember, this wasn't about Gentiles at all. They had already settled that. Gentiles did not have to keep the law. Gentiles were not under the law of Israel. But if they were Jews ethnically, then they were required to still keep the law, but not keep the law to be right with God, but keep the law because God gave it to them, because they're right with God. And so we see at the end of last week, Paul goes out and carries out this initiation. And we're going to pick up from there. How does the plan work? We're going to see when Paul returns to complete the vow a week later, a riot ensues. And we're going to look at that today. And what I want us to see as we go through these verses is Paul uses this as an opportunity. What you're going to notice is when Paul gives a defense, his defense isn't really about what he's done. His defense isn't really about what he has or hasn't said. His defense is the defense of the gospel. And so as we go through this, look at, I think we can learn a lot from Paul's logic thought as he goes through defending the gospel. So let's look at Acts chapter 21 and verse 27. When the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and the place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort, and all of Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when the tribune and the soldiers, when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, couldn't get that word out, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were shouting one thing, some another. And as he could not learn the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob had followed, the mob of the people followed, crying out, "Away with him!" Let's stop there real quick. Part of the cleansing ceremony, part of a vow would be ritualistic cleansing. This would happen on the 3rd and the 7th day. And so what we see here as part of the vow that they've taken, Paul is there on the 7th day, we're told. So this is the end of the vow, and he's doing the ritualistic, he's there to do the ritualistic cleansing that's required in the law. And as he's going through this, some Jews from Asia, we're told. Remember, Asia is a little different than we consider Asia, if you'll remember the map. And Ephesus is part of what Romans considered Asia. So some people from Ephesus, originally, they see a man they recognize. A man that's from Ephesus. And they know he's a Gentile. And he's with Paul. And they see him in the city. And they put 2 and 2 together and get 4 in their minds. And they say, we've heard that Paul has said don't follow that Jews don't have to follow the law. We've heard that Jews living in Gentile areas don't have to obey the law. And now we see Paul. We've seen this man from Ephesus, this Jew from Ephesus, with Paul in the city, and now we see, or this Gentile from Ephesus in the city. Now we see Paul in the temple, and we've put this together and said Paul's brought Gentiles into the temple. And therefore, he's desecrated this holy space. Now we know this was an issue of the day, just kind of an aside. The archaeologists have found markers 4.5 feet high, written in Greek and Latin, that would tell people of the time, tell Gentiles, and it was around the inner courts and the outer court, and say, you're not allowed beyond this area. So Gentile believers could come to the outer court and worship, but they couldn't come into the inner courts. There were 4 inner courts, if you're not familiar with the temple. You had the court of women. After the court of women, that's where women and children would go. So when you see even male children, then usually until they got of a certain age, they stayed with the women in the court of women. Once they progressed, the court of men, and so that's where all the Jewish men would go and worship. Inside of that, you had the holy place where only the priests could go. And then inside of that, of course, we're all very familiar with the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest can go, and he can only go once a year on the Day of Atonement. So if you can picture that kind of, this is all, Paul has come in as he can as a Jew into the inner, but he's been dragged to the outer court, where only the Gentiles could go because of this. And so they drag him out there, and they begin to beat him. And word then reaches the tribune. The tribune would have been the military commander. There was a barracks on the northwest corner of the temple that would overlook the temple so they could see what was going on, if anything was happening. And then had steps. If they needed to respond to something, they had steps that would go, 2 sets of steps actually, that would go into the outer court where Gentiles could be. And so they would go into the outer courts and deal with anything. So they see there's an uproar. They hear there's something going on. And they can look into the outer courts and see that there is some violence going on, something's happening that threatens the peace of Rome. If you remember, we've talked about the peace of Rome. And so this tribune, who is a commander in charge of a cohort of 1,000 men, he responds. We don't know how many troops he responded with. We know probably at least 200 because we see multiple, it's plural, in the centurions. He went with centurions, plural. A centurion was in charge of 100 men. And so we know that there's at least 200 because it is a plural. We don't know exactly how many. Anyway, it's a significant force. You can imagine being in the middle and 200 battle-hardened soldiers arrive in their war gear, with their swords, with their javelins, with their shields. If you can imagine that, it's an awesome display of power. And it's a display that Rome would often do to stop people. To say, oh, well, Rome's here, we got to stop. Or we die. And so it wasn't unusual for this overbearing display of military power to be used. And so they see this force and they stop beating Paul. And the commander, wanting to restore order, takes him into custody. And we told him with 2 chains, basically he's chained to 2 soldiers, one on each side. And so Paul is incapacitated. And the commander wants to know what's going on. Now it's funny because remember these people are from Ephesus. It's the ones that stirred up the Jews. And what happened in Ephesus? There was a mob against Paul. And what happened when he was placed under arrest in Ephesus? Mob mentality is not logical. You have a few people that stir it up, then you have everybody else just reacting out of emotion. And we see that here. This is a mob mentality. And as they've gone to, somebody stirred them up, and they don't even know why they're mad. They're just mad. They're not ascertaining facts. They're not here to determine what's true and what's not true. They're just reacting. And so they participate in the beating, but then when they're questioned as to why they're beating this man, they don't know. Some say one thing, and some say another. It is so confusing, so emotional, and not fact-based that the tribune doesn't know what the truth is. And so he's going to pull Paul out of the situation, take him back to the barracks, and try to get to the truth with him. We're going to find out really by beating him, but he's going to beat the truth out of him in his mind. So he pulls them out, and we're told that the crowd is still so agitated. Even though you have this overwhelming power, this overwhelming force that's there, they're still so agitated that they feared for Paul's life, that he was going to be ripped apart. And the soldiers, and because he's bound, he can't defend himself. So the soldiers actually physically carry him into the barracks to protect him from the Jews. And now we get to Paul's reaction to all this. Paul trusts God and yet argues his case. I think it's interesting here that Paul trusts God. He's been warned, don't go. He's been warned, you're going to be put in chains. What has just happened? Because of the Jews' reactions, they didn't put him in chains, but he's been chained. He's been warned this was going to happen, and yet he has trusted God more than he's worried about his own life. And we see what has been told was going to happen has happened. But yet at the same time, when it comes down to, he feels that he has the right, and it's not lack of faith in God, to give a proper defense. And he uses the Roman legal system, and we're going to see this week and next week, he uses the Roman legal system to defend. That's not lack of trusting God, though. He trusts God, but uses what's available to him. And so he starts by talking to this tribune to clear up a mistake, or a mistaken identity. Let's look at verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, "May I say something to you?" And he said, "Do you know Greek? Are you not the Egyptian then, who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness?" Paul replied, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." So Paul speaks to this Roman tribune in Greek, and he's shocked. He says, "Wait a minute, I thought you were somebody else, and you speak our language as if you know it." He said, "Aren't you this Egyptian?" And he's talking about an Egyptian, Josephus, the Roman historian, the Jewish historian, gives us a background to this. 3 years earlier, there was an Egyptian who stirred up the Jews. And he stirred them up, and he made a claim. He gathered thousands of people around, rallied around his cause, and he said he was going to bring down the walls of the temple, just like the walls of Jericho came down. In the name of God, because they were not being pious to follow God, but they were collaborating with the Romans, he was going to come tear down the walls of the temple. Just like God had caused happen in Jericho. And when he was approaching, when he hit the Mount of Olives, the Romans who had heard he was coming attacked. And we're told in the historical records that 400 men perished, a couple hundred were captured, and the rest disappeared, including the leader. So this is a man that's wanted for high sedition. It's a man that the Romans would be looking for. It's a man that the Jews who don't want trouble with the Romans would be looking for. And so they think, well, this must be that Egyptian guy. Or the tribune thinks that. And so, and he doesn't know what's going on. Remember, he doesn't know the Jewish language. And so as they're talking probably in Aramaic back and forth, he doesn't know what they're saying. It's kind of like being in a foreign country. When you just see a lot of things happening. You don't necessarily know what's happening because you can't understand them. So he's trying to find out, but there's a language barrier. Well, Paul heals that language barrier by telling him, by speaking to him in the language he knows, into the Greek language. And he asked him, are you this man, this Egyptian? That's who I thought you were. You're dangerous. And Paul's response is meant to let him know, I'm not a threat to Rome. What did he say? Well, I'm not the Egyptian. I'm a Jew. I belong here. I'm a Jew, but I'm from Tarsus in Sicilia. Now, Tarsus was a very important city in the empire. It was considered the cultural center of Hellenism. It was an important trade for textiles and dyes. And so it was a very cultured, important city. And so Paul is painting a picture. Look, you thought I was this Egyptian rebel. I'm not him. I'm a Jew. I belong here. And I'm not just a Jew. I'm no threat because I'm a sophisticated cultural Jew from a cultural Roman city, an important city. And so he puts at rest this idea that he may be a threat to Rome. And with that, then, he asks the question, he says, can I make a statement? Can I speak to the people? I'm a Jew, they're a Jew. I'm no threat to Rome. I'm not sowing dissent. Can I speak to them? And the tribune, and we don't know why, but probably the tribune thinks, oh, this is just a case of mistaken identity. So he gives him permission to speak to the people. So let's see how that goes in verse 40. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Sicilia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of the elders can bear witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. So this first step in making this defense, he essentially says, I was where you are now. Listen to me, because I was where you are now. And making that defense is, I was a Jew just like you. I was born a Jew. I was born into the people of God. I was born into the Jewish community. I am a chosen one of God, just like you. But even more than that, I was educated under the respected theological teacher. I'm educated in the law. I don't discount the law. I'm educated in the law. In fact, one of the most leading theologians of the day, I was a student of. I know the law. I'm not someone who's against the law. Just like you, I'm zealous for the law. It's not only that was I educated, but I'm a Pharisee by background. I'm part of the sect that loves and wants to keep the law. The law is important to me. It was important to my father before me. It's important to me now. How could I teach against the law? I'm a Pharisee that calls all Jews to abide by the law. Not only am I a Pharisee, I was so zealous for the law, just like you're so zealous for the law. And when you thought I violated the law, that you attacked me out of your zeal, I also attacked those of the way. Just like you, where you are now, I once was, loving the law, serving God through the law, and defending the law. I understand your desires. I understand your anger, because I once was where you are now. But while he has a zeal for the law of God, God intervened and revealed errors in his understanding of God's will. Look at chapter 22, verse 6. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken by all the Jews who lived there, came to me. And standing by me said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. Paul says, I once was where you are now. I was part of the people of God. I was zealous for the law. I was zealous to serve God. I wouldn't put up with anybody who didn't follow the law. In fact, I would persecute them. That's how zealous I was. But while I was sincere in my beliefs, God showed me I was sincerely wrong. I was sincere and zealous for him, but I didn't understand his will. And God loved me so much that he didn't allow me to continue on that path, but he revealed himself to me. In fact, he did it in a very miraculous way. He shone his glory that was so bright, so glorious, like a light, that it knocked me to the ground and blinded me. The God who I was zealous to serve, but I was serving with a misunderstanding, loved me enough to knock me on my can and blind me and reveal himself to me. God revealed himself. I once were where you are, but I was called by God into truth. And so we see his point is, and I didn't know, I just knew this glory was such that it drew me down, and I knew God was involved in this. And so I ascertained, who are you? This must be God. Who are you? Who else, when they reveal their glory, can blind a man? Who else, when they reveal his glory so much for humanity, it can drive you down to the ground? And so he ascertains, who are you, Lord? I've loved you. I've attempted to serve you. You're revealing yourself to me. I recognize that it's you. And who are you, though? And this is where his theology is corrected. He says, I am Jesus of Nazareth. whom you're persecuting. You're sincere, Paul, but you're sincerely wrong. And I love you too much to leave you in that wrong spot. So I'm revealing myself. I'm calling you in a supernatural way. And we see Paul respond in faith. What shall I do, Lord? I've revealed myself in my glory. You've learned who I am. And it doesn't matter what all these people that were with you think about your response. You're here to persecute those who call Jesus the Messiah. Now all of a sudden I've revealed to you that I am the Messiah. And Paul's response is, I don't care what they think. I only care about you. What must I do? What must I do? You've called me. What must I do? And he was told, go into Damascus. And he would send another devout man who also loves the law to come and explain. And so Ananias, and this points out to the crowd, hey, this isn't just Paul. There are other devout Jews who are zealous for the law, who also believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Who has a good reputation for following the law amongst the Jews. He came and God used him to restore my sight. It was God who called him. Ananias can attest to this. He was there. God's call to Paul came with he didn't just love him and call him to salvation, though. He called and had a purpose for him. And that purpose was to be the witnesses to the nations. Look at verse 15. And he said, the God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name. So God calls Paul, but he calls him with a purpose. And Ananias reveals to him, hey, you've been called directly by God. You've been called to know his will. Remember, I think I'm doing his will. I'm zealous for his will. I'm zealous for the law. I believe this is the will of God. I really want to serve God. And he says, now you're called to really know the will of God. We're going to correct your errors. God loves you so much, he didn't leave you in error, but he called you to be redeemed. And to see the righteous one. The righteous one is Jesus Christ, who he's talking about. You are going to see Jesus Christ and what? Hear a voice from his mouth. Now, those who see Jesus Christ, who have walked with Jesus Christ, who have been taught directly by Jesus Christ, are called apostles. I know there are denominations that like to use that term, but in the technical term, an apostle is only someone who has physically or in a supernatural way seen and walked and been taught by directly Jesus Christ. This is why Paul later comes out and says, we've got all these apostles that walk with him physically, and I respect them, but I'm also been called an apostle out of season. Yeah, I didn't walk with him when he walked around this earth. But I was called out of season. He revealed himself to me. And we're told that he's taken away, remember we talked about that when we studied these verses early on in Acts. And he was physically taught. He was taught directly by Jesus. There are other books where he writes and he says, look, I didn't learn my theology. I didn't learn what God's will is. I didn't learn about God, about Jesus Christ from the apostles. I learned from Jesus himself as an apostle. And so he says, you're called. God loved you too much to leave you in error, and he's going to reveal the truth to you, the truth of his will, and he's got a purpose for that in making you an apostle. An apostle so that you will be a witness to the nations. And here he defines witnesses we've discussed over and over again. A witness is simply what? Someone who says what you've seen and what you've heard, what you've experienced. Paul doesn't have to know everything. He has to know what he's seen and what he's heard. Now, he's going to be taught by Jesus, so he's going to hear a lot of things. He's going to have a lot of experience. He's going to see God work in many ways. Remember, he's just come back as he's recounting this. But he said, I was called to be a witness. I was saved by the grace of God and given a purpose for that salvation by his grace. And therefore, because he's been called, now he has responded in faith. What must I do, Lord? He is to what? Rise and be baptized, calling on the name of Jesus. The salvation is the calling on the name of Jesus. The baptism is the physical representation or testimony to the world. Yeah, I know you're a Pharisee. I know you're a Jew, an ethnic Jew. I know you're a Pharisee. I know you're a theologian who studied. I know you're zealous. But guess what, Paul? You're also a sinner. I know you didn't think you were, but you are. And now that you've come to know that and put your faith in Jesus and not in your law, be baptized as a testimony to the world. And God has a purpose for him. Let's close out with these last few verses. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, "Make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." And I said, "Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who were believing in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles." So I once was like you are now, zealous. I wanted to serve God. But I was wrong. And God loved me so much, he called me personally. He corrected my understanding. And then he not only saved me through that loving call, but then he gave me a purpose to be his witness. And as I'm fulfilling that purpose, I come back to Jerusalem. And you can't say I was against the law, because where did you find me? You found me being a good Jew where you would find good Jews in the temple praying. It wasn't I was called by Jesus and I abandoned the law. I was called by Jesus for salvation and understood as a Jew, I obey the law now in obedience to God. Not to earn his favor, but because I have experienced his favor. And so I was there when God showed me the extent of the purpose he had for me. He said, "Get out, the Jews are not going to accept you." He said, I even argued with God. I said, "God, really? I mean, come on. I have a good reputation here. I'm the perfect one to witness to the Jews. I've got a great reputation here. They'll see all that I've done for you." You guys said, "No, they're not going to accept you. But I'm going to send you to the hated Gentiles. I've got a bigger purpose for you." And next week, we're going to see the response. Remember this, he's given his defense before the people right now. We're going to see their response at this point. But let's stop there. What do we get out of this? What can come out of this? I think this is a great outline for what it means to be a witness. I think if you use this as an outline, this is a good outline for what it means to give a defense for the faith that you have, as we're called to give. I once was where you are now. I once was a sinner who believed I could make myself right. I once was one who rejected the concept of a God. I once was one who thought I was right by God by all my religious actions. I once was one who believed I served God by all the study that I did. I was where you are now, wherever that person's been. There is a connection point because we were all sinners. God didn't come to the bargain aisle to get anybody. He brought his grace for everybody. I once where you are now. I understand what you're thinking, but God's love didn't leave me, and God called me by his grace and his love. Now, what's where you are, I understand, but God loves and calls, and he called me. Whatever that looks like in your life. However he did that. He had to call you. If you're a child of the king called you. You didn't call the king. And so I experienced God's love and his grace that I didn't deserve. And because of that love and grace, when I surrendered to his offer of forgiveness, made him the center of my life. He didn't just save me for heaven sometime in the future, as great as that's going to be. He restored me to a purposeful life. There was a purpose. He called me and gave me a purpose in life. And that purpose is to be his witness. To share uniquely with each of us what we have seen and what we have experienced of the love and grace of Jesus Christ. To share that. And I think that's a great reminder of our purpose in life. Our purpose in life isn't to make ourselves happy. Our purpose in life isn't to avoid conflict. Our purpose in life is to have, as we saw in Sunday school today, to have our whole world, everything about us, completely surround and be influenced by and be dedicated to God. And share that love and the grace that, if you're a believer, you have experienced and didn't deserve. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, we love you. Lord, we recognize you're the giver of all good things. And that begins by giving us love that we don't deserve and grace that in many cases we should not receive. Lord, we've rebelled against you. We've made ourselves the center of